My sister stood at the front of that CPA Ontario disciplinary hearing, like she was delivering a keynote address. She had rehearsed the grief out of her body, and replaced it with a kind of sorrowful professionalism. The reluctant truth-teller, finally forced to speak. I sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany conference table, my hands flat on the polished surface, and I did not say a single word. The panel chair, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, had been making careful notes since the session opened. She was methodical, thorough. Then she reached a section deeper in the evidence folder my sister's lawyer had submitted, and her pen slowed. It stopped entirely. She read something again, set the pen down with the deliberate precision of someone who has just discovered they are holding something they were not prepared to hold. She pressed her palms flat against the table, pushed her chair back, and stood up. "I need a recess," she said to no one in particular. She walked out with the folder held against her chest, and did not look at anyone as she left. My sister turned to face me for the first time all morning. She let a small private smile cross her face. The kind that said she believed the verdict was already written and she had written it herself. She had absolutely no idea what was inside that folder. The complaint arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in early February, delivered by courier to my office in Mississauga. The CPA Ontario letterhead was embossed into the upper left corner of the envelope. I was between client calls. I made the mistake of opening it at my desk in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, with my coffee still warm. The summary was 5 pages and completely precise. My sister had filed a formal complaint, alleging I had fraudulently misrepresented my CPA designation, operated under fabricated credentials for years, and manipulated client trust accounts across a period of several years. 2 supporting affidavits were attached beneath her signature. The first belonged to my mother, the second to my father. I read my father's name 3 times. Then I put on my coat, drove 40 minutes west on the QEW, and rang my parents' doorbell in Oakville. My mother answered in the unhurried way. She managed everything. Door pulled wide, posture perfectly composed, her expression already settling into the careful neutrality she deployed whenever she had decided in advance to be blameless. She stepped back to let me in without saying anything. My father was at the kitchen table with his reading glasses on, a mug of tea going cold beside the newspaper. Their house still smelled exactly the way it always had. That particular warmth of cinnamon and old wood in their brand of polished, careful living. Standing in that kitchen with the complaint letter in my hand, I was struck by how completely unchanged everything looked, as though nothing irreversible had been signed in this room on some quiet afternoon. I placed the letter flat on the table between us. My father picked it up. He read it with the same deliberate calm he brought to everything. Receipts, contracts, disappointing news. Then he set it back down and folded his hands on top of it. My mother sat across from me, folded her own hands, and said, in the gentle and practiced voice she reserved for conversations she had already rehearsed, that they had not wanted it to come to this, but they had concerns they could not in good conscience ignore. My sister had raised questions about my professional conduct over the years, and as my parents, they believed they had a responsibility to support what they understood to be true, even when that was painful. I asked her what my sister had told them. She said that was not the point. My father said the family company had given me every professional opportunity, that my departure from it had been abrupt and ungrateful, that he had supported my education expecting it would benefit the company eventually, and instead it had benefited only me. He said my choices had caused a great deal of difficulty for everyone, and he said it with the composed certainty of a man who had spent 30 years, being the final word in every room he entered. I stood in that kitchen and looked at the 2 of them. My mother with her folded hands, my father with his reasonable expression, both of them absolutely certain that what they had done was defensible, that they had weighed the options and arrived at the correct conclusion. And something that had been blurring at the edges of my understanding for years, came suddenly and completely into focus. This was not impulsive. There had been a conversation before this, an agreement. They had signed their names to a document capable of ending my career, and they had done it in this kitchen, probably at this same table, and they had assumed I would have no way to fight it. I picked up the letter, I walked back to my car. I sat in the driveway with the engine running, and watched the snow settle over their front lawn for a minute or 2. Then I drove back to Mississauga and got to work. My sister was many things, but impulsive was not one of them. That was what had always made her quietly dangerous, not the dramatic confrontations, but the patience, the willingness to position herself carefully and wait. The family had rewarded that quality so consistently for so long, that she had stopped questioning whether her instincts were sound. They were not always sound. I had been running my own forensic accounting practice for 3 years. I spent my days reconstructing what had gone wrong inside other people's finances, tracing where the money had gone, identifying the moments when someone had made a decision they hoped no one would ever bother to examine. After 3 years of that work, you develop a precise awareness of what your own financial life looks like from the outside. You become careful in ways other people don't think to be careful. 2 years before the complaint arrived, I had started being careful about the family company. I called my colleague Jules the evening after Oakville. We had gone through the CPA program together at university, and she now ran the digital forensics unit at a mid-size firm in downtown Toronto. We met the next morning at a Tim Hortons on the edge of the industrial park near my office, in the middle of a gray February morning, with the parking lot half plowed, and the coffee lineup backed out the door. She was already there when I arrived, laptop open, a double-double in hand, looking like someone who had been awake since 5 and considered that a normal start. I sat down and walked her through 18 months of observations. My parents' company managed residential and commercial real estate across the GTA. Property management in Ontario operates under strict provincial guidelines around trust accounts, tenant deposits, collected rent held in trust, capital reserves for building maintenance. Every dollar in those accounts has a paper origin and a paper destination, and a regulatory obligation to be exactly where it is supposed to be, to the cent. My sister had been CFO of the family company for 4 years. In that time, client trust account balances had been declining in a pattern that did not match the company's portfolio. Expenses had been reclassified. Administrative fees had appeared in internal records without corresponding invoices in the vendor files. And in 2021, a numbered company had been quietly registered with the provincial corporate registry. No disclosure to the family company's board, no mention in any annual filing, no trace in any document the company had ever shared with an external party. The principal on that numbered company was my sister. Jules typed without interrupting until I stopped talking. Then she looked up and asked how long I had been building this. I told her about 18 months. She said she would need 10 days to cross-reference everything properly. It took 11. We met twice more in that period. Once at her office on Bay Street, late enough that the building was mostly empty, and once back at the same Tim Hortons, the February dark already down by 5 o'clock. What Jules assembled was methodical and exact. Transaction timestamps mapped against the property management software's access logs, wire transfers traced through the numbered company's accounts, a record covering 32 months showing approximately $380,000 CAD moved out of client trust accounts into entities with no legitimate connection to those clients. She had also identified the timeline pressure. The CRA had notified the family company several months earlier that a routine compliance audit was scheduled for the spring. The clock was running. That was when the motive clicked into place, with ugly clarity. If my professional designation was suspended pending investigation, my active client files would require court-appointed trustee to manage the transition. My sister, with her own accounting credentials and her existing standing in the family company, would be positioned to petition the court for that role. My client accounts held significant trust balances, including the proceeds from several large estate settlements waiting on final distribution. She needed access to roughly $380,000. My career was the bridge she had chosen to cross to get it. Jules printed the summary report after midnight on a Thursday, 42 pages with exhibits. She stacked it on the table between us and said what forensic accountants learn to say without sentiment. This is what the numbers say. I drove home through the dark and sat at my kitchen table with the report and thought about a night when I was 20 years old. I had come home from university for the winter break, holding the letter, confirming I had placed first in my cohort that semester. I had wanted to show my parents in person. My father had read it, set it back on the counter, and said that accounting was a reasonable path for someone without particularly large ambitions. He said it with the same mild interest he might bring to a weather report. My mother had been at the sink and had said nothing at all. I had gone back to campus 3 days early. I had worked without stopping for the rest of that year. And I had built everything I owned carefully enough that I always knew exactly what I had, where it was, and what it was worth. The report went into its envelope. My hands were completely steady. 3 weeks later, I walked into that hearing room on Bay Street and took my seat. My sister performed brilliantly that morning. I will give her that without qualification. She presented the complaint with measured, reluctant grief. The family member who had delayed for years out of loyalty and finally painfully felt she had no other choice. She used the correct regulatory terminology. She cited specific dates and file numbers. She did not once look in my direction. She called my father as a supporting witness. He testified with the composed authority of someone who had always been the most credible person in every room he entered. He said he had harbored doubts about my credentials for some time, that he had chosen out of parental obligation not to raise them sooner, and that he now understood that misplaced loyalty had been a disservice to the profession and to the clients who deserved better. He said this under oath, without any visible hesitation, in the same measured voice he used for everything. My mother followed. She described a letter she claimed to have found in my childhood bedroom. She still called it that, a letter I had supposedly written to her years earlier, referencing exam results she had always thought seemed unusually high. She said she had brought a printed copy because she felt the panel deserved to see it. She pressed a folded tissue gently against the corner of her eye as she handed it across to the panel coordinator. I let every word of it go onto the record. I did not object. I did not lean toward my representative. I sat with my hands flat on the table and I let them finish every sentence. When my representative stood up, she placed Jules's 42-page report in front of the panel chair. Then the corporate registry filing for the numbered company. Then the timestamp transaction log. Cross-reference it against trust account shortfalls. Then the wire transfer records. Then the single-page summary showing $380,000 CAD traced, dollar by dollar, from client trust accounts to entities registered in my sister's name. Then she asked my sister, directly and without preface, to explain the numbered company. My sister's posture changed before she said a word. Something shifted in the set of her shoulders, barely visible, the way a structure shows its first movement before it falls. She gripped the edge of the table. She looked at our parents for the first time all morning. She said there was a reasonable explanation. That the numbered company had a legitimate business purpose, she said, simply not had the opportunity to document properly. That the transfers had been discussed with our father, and he had been aware of them. That our mother had known as well. That she had been working in good faith under significant pressure, and that presenting these documents without proper context was a deliberate attempt to mislead the panel. My father stood up from the observer's chair. He said, quietly, and with complete composure, that he had approved no transfers and had had no knowledge of the numbered company's existence until the documents were placed in front of the panel that morning. He said it once. He did not raise his voice. The room went very still. The panel chair called a recess. It lasted 50 minutes. When she returned, she informed the room that she had been in contact with the CRA's compliance division, which had opened a preliminary inquiry into the family company's trust account discrepancies based on information submitted through appropriate regulatory channels 3 weeks earlier, before the hearing had even been scheduled. The complaint against me was dismissed in its entirety. My sister was formally referred to the investigative body for a review of her own professional conduct. My parents were asked to remain in the hall, where a compliance officer was available, to speak with them, at their earliest convenience. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and walked out. 4 days later, a message arrived on my phone from a number I did not recognize. It was my sister, writing from a device I had no record of. She said she had retained counsel and intended to pursue every available civil remedy against me for what she described as a deliberate and malicious campaign to destroy her reputation and her career. She said our father stood fully behind her, and that the family's network in the industry would ensure my practice was effectively shut out of work across the GTA for years. There was a problem with that message. Her conditions as a preliminary respondent in the CRA inquiry expressly prohibited any contact with potential witnesses or complainants in the regulatory matter. I was a potential witness. My representative forwarded the screenshot to the investigating officer before the close of business that day. 2 evenings later, my father called me directly. It was the first time he had dialed my number in 4 years. He did not open with an apology. He opened with a summary, presented with the clean efficiency he brought to quarterly business reviews, of the company's current exposures now that the CRA inquiry had formally expanded in scope. He said the company represented 3 decades of his working life. He said his own legal counsel had advised full cooperation with the CRA review in exchange for a reduced liability assessment. He said, in a voice that had gone very flat, that he was no longer in a financial position to fund my sister's legal defense. He said he was calling as a professional courtesy, to let me know he intended no further involvement in my affairs. I told him I had heard everything he said. I told him that the restraining order application, covering both him and my mother, had been filed with the court that morning, and that he would be hearing from his own lawyer about it within the week. Then I hung up, and I sat at my kitchen window, and I let the quiet come in around me. The lake had started to break up at the edges. Mid-March, that particular stage of Ontario winter, when the ice is still solid and dark out in the middle. But the shoreline has opened up again, a foot or two of cold black water catching the last of the evening light. I made tea and watched the water for a long time. There was no dramatic feeling, no surge of vindication or rush of relief. What settled in was something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. The particular stillness of a person who has done exactly what needed to be done, and does not require anyone else to acknowledge it. People who know what happened sometimes ask me how I stayed calm through all of it. How I sat in that hearing room for hours without reacting. How I watched my parents testify against me under oath and said nothing. They ask whether I ever doubted that the evidence would hold. The honest answer is that I had stopped building the evidence for other people and had started building it for myself. There is a meaningful difference. Documentation done out of fear is incomplete and frantic. Documentation done as a sustained practice, because you understand that the truth is something you are personally responsible for preserving, is different. It becomes a habit of precision, and precision, maintained long enough, becomes its own kind of permanence. It exists independent of whether anyone chooses to look at it or believe it. But what the hearing showed me went beyond the value of documentation. The first thing I understood, watching my father stand up and cut my sister loose in under a sentence, was the true cost of the position she had held her entire life. She had been the chosen one, the trusted one, the believed one, The one our parents backed in every disagreement without asking many questions. And I had spent years, in honesty, carrying a low-grade resentment about it that I am not proud of, because I had misread the situation entirely. Being the golden child in a family like ours was not a gift. It was a role. A position you occupied for as long as you served the family's interests, and from which you were removed the moment your problems became more expensive than your usefulness. The scapegoat, by contrast, is already free, already without illusions about what the relationship actually is. I had been devastated, at 20, to understand that my family's support was conditional. That understanding turned out to be an early release. My sister received hers in a hearing room on Bay Street, in her 50s, in front of a compliance officer and a panel recorder, and I do not imagine it felt like freedom to her at the time. The second thing was about silence as an active choice. Every time I chose not to react publicly, not to defend myself on social media, not to call mutual acquaintances, not to demand explanations I already knew would not be honest ones, I was protecting the record. My parents' perjury went onto the official transcript because I did not interrupt it. Their choices went into the regulatory file because I documented them rather than confronting them. Families like mine survive on reaction. They need you to explode so they can point to the explosion as evidence that you are the problem. When you refuse to explode, when you document instead, quietly, over months and years, you take away the one lever they have over you. The third thing was the hardest to learn and the most important. The people who work hardest to tell you what you are worth are almost always the people most threatened by the value you have already built without their help. My father's dismissal of my career, all those years ago in that kitchen, was not a genuine assessment of my abilities. It was a warning. Independence is the thing a controlling system cannot absorb. When you stop needing the system's approval, you expose the fact that the whole structure only held together because people like you agreed to stay small inside it. They did not try to destroy my career because they believed I had failed. They tried to destroy it because I had succeeded on terms they had not set, and that made everything they had ever said about me harder to believe. My practice is doing well. I have clients I respect and work I find genuinely meaningful, and a small team of people who show up carefully every day. The CRA review of the family company is ongoing and, from what I understand through the regulatory process, the scope of what they have found continues to expand. My sister is managing her situation without our father's financial backing, which is proving difficult. My parents and I have not spoken since the restraining order was served. That particular grief is real, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. I mourn the family they could have been. The parents who might have framed that semester letter instead of dismissing it. The ones who might have driven back to campus with me that January, or at least waved from the door. That version of them never existed, but I spent a long time grieving it anyway, and I think that grief was reasonable. Grief and damage are different things. Though, you can carry one without letting the other keep making your decisions for you. If there is someone in your life right now who claims to love you, while working quietly against your independence, someone whose loyalty appears and disappears depending entirely on whether you are useful to them in that moment, I want to ask you one thing. How much of your energy is going, right now, toward earning something that was never actually being offered? You are allowed to stop. Build what is yours, keep your own records. Trust that solid ground, constructed carefully and honestly over time, holds even when everything around it is breaking open. Spring comes to the lake, whether you are ready for it or not. So does the thaw.